Hi everyone, hope everyone's having a good afternoon or evening whenever you're listening to this. But I'm Tom, and today I'm just going to be going through a biomechanical question and answer from last Wednesday. So on Wednesdays I'm going to be putting out Q&As and just asking if anyone has any questions about biomechanics. So these can be as simple or as complicated as you want. There's not really a right or wrong question here. I just want to see if you guys have any specific questions that I can answer through the lens that I look at things. Because I suppose sometimes just getting different ways of or different approaches of how you can approach a problem is sometimes the easiest way just to kind of get a quick answer. It might fill in gaps in your head of a way you think something might work. So biomechanics questions don't have to be anything super hectic. They can just be questions about injury, rehab, performance, training, technique. Just I guess kind of the whys and hows about how humans move or how humans move under a barbell. So on Wednesday last week I had a question about stabilizer muscles and why barbell lifting is typically thought of being better for recruiting stabilizer muscles. I thought this was an interesting one as well because I just want to touch on, I suppose, why I think trying to recruit stabilizer muscles probably isn't as important as what we thought it was initially. But I guess to begin with, I want to talk about the planes of motion because that's really where the stabilizer muscles come into play, I suppose, as being under the spotlight. So there's three planes of motion generally with human movement. We've got the sagittal plane, which is very much up, down, forwards, backwards. So generally in regards to barbell lifting, this is a lot of machine-based work. The machine generally takes away the other planes of motion, just makes it very easy to operate on up, down, forwards, backwards. So leg extensions, leg press, chest press machines, those kinds of things, they're very, very sagittal based. Then we've also got frontal plane. So frontal plane is pretty much anything left to right, shifting, those kinds of things. Frontal plane is generally the big difference between barbell lifting and machine lifting. Barbell lifting will really start to apply more movement on the frontal plane compared to machine lifting. And this is neither a good or bad thing, it's a thing. If we can learn to utilize this, we can actually get more and more compression and pressure and force by utilizing our frontal plane when we are lifting. And I'll touch on this briefly in a second. And then we've also got the transverse plane. So transverse plane is pretty much rotation, so twisting left to right through the torso is a really good example of transverse plane. So a lot of running stuff or single arm stuff or those kinds of things are typically thought of as being transverse. So if we bring it back to machines versus barbell, for example, typically barbell lifting is thought of as being better for recruiting stabilizer muscles because it has that addition of everything kind of happening more on the frontal plane and even a little bit on the transverse plane too. Because we're not locked into a machine that has rigid rails or tracks, like a leg press, for example, our body has to mitigate the forces of the barbell, of gravity, and that doesn't always look as clean as a machine. We do have lots of motion that might be leaning a little bit more into shifting into one hip, or we might be twisting a little bit more into one shoulder. And these aren't necessarily good or bad things. Once again, this is just more so because we've taken away the constraints of the machine, no one's body moves perfectly symmetrical. Symmetry in the human body just doesn't exist, and it never will exist because we're naturally asymmetrical. So typically because of this, because we have more movement on the frontal plane or the transverse plane, it's thought of as our conventionally thought of as muscle stabilizers have to engage more. And generally speaking, when we think muscle stabilizers for the lower body, this is talking about our glute med muscles, our smaller glute muscles, even our glutes in general. Some people think of adductors too. For the upper body, it's generally thought of as being our rotator cuff. So the muscles that are generally meant to kind of smooth the movement and get rid of a lot of those frontal plane kind of issues that might be occurring. But I guess this is probably a better example for the lower body, but rather than thinking of it as being a stabilizer issue that we need to address, like I was saying earlier, by learning to control our frontal plane a bit more, we can actually learn to get more force or more output from our lower body. And probably the easiest way to imagine this is through pronation of our foot, or even pronation of our upper body, but we're going to talk about the lower body just to keep it all just kind of on the same page. So if you don't know what pronation of the foot is, imagine this is my foot here. Generally speaking, pronation of the foot is where our foot flattens and spreads out as much as it can, like the hands here. So it's increasing in surface area, like the foot is spreading out and getting more surface area contact with the ground. So it's like anything, generally if we have a wider base of support or a larger surface area of contact with wherever we're trying to push from, we're going to feel more stable. And that's just generally because our base of support has increased. And with something like a squat, if we have a wider base of support compared to like a narrower sort of like where we're holding the weight, so for example like a wider stance squat where our feet are very pronated, we're going to feel quite stable because we've got a very wide base of support and we've got a heap of pronation or foot contact or surface area contact. So if we're coming down into a squat and we're letting our body utilize this pronation, keeping that surface area contact, trying to maintain that wide base of support, we're going to feel quite stable. Obviously the caveat of this is making sure that our body can do this, and I guess that might be a video for another time, but like ensuring that we have the movement options to achieve pronation, to achieve internal rotation, to achieve a wide stance and have enough hip flexion to come down into a squat. So rather than it being necessarily about having strong stabilizer muscles, it's more so about just knowing how to control our body on the frontal plane or even the transverse plane. And we can do this through just like getting better at the skill of actual barbell lifting, and like more so understanding that there is going to be more so like forces on us rather than just up, down, forwards, backwards. There is going to be some frontal plane forces left and right, or some transverse plane forces. But we can also use accessories to help practice this. And this might be where doing some single leg stuff could be useful and teaching our body how to pronate and internally rotate. The same thing also occurs for the upper body too. So upper body, like I guess we can also think of this like a slightly different way of creating stability, in that external rotation of the shoulders is generally what makes a shoulder feel more stable, or makes it feel kind of like it has increased stability. And there are a lot of exercises around that work on shoulder external rotation. So that might be like just generally external rotation exercise like that, or face pulls, those kinds of motions. And most people find that they're going to have issues with stability as the bar comes down to the chest. So as they bring the bar down, they will start to externally rotate to try and increase those stabilizer muscles and try and make them feel stronger or more jammed. So rather than thinking of it as like just being on the stabilizer muscles, our torso or our midsection actually has a really big role in controlling our stabilizers. So if you are feeling unstable on something like a bench press, one of the best things you can do is just learn how to externally rotate your ribs instead. So if we get better at externally rotating our full ribs, so this isn't just our lower ribs, this is middle, upper, like all the way up into the collarbone, and kind of even like neck area, like all of these guys are externally rotating up, flaring up, pushing up, meeting the bar. The muscles on the back of our body are going to be contracting, and those muscles do generally create a little bit of external rotation from the shoulder. So if you are coming down, you might actually be able to feel the same amount of like stability or compression or tightness or strength that you were by tucking your elbows, but you might actually need to tuck your elbows that much. So this comes down to like preferences in technique, differences in anthropometry, like how big your arch is, all those kinds of things. But it's just another way of thinking of it, rather than not necessarily just having to increase like just those small muscles there or the joint itself. We can use the rest of our body to try and get that increase in that stable feeling, just to make us feel stronger. And bench press is a really good example of that. So I guess like when it comes to stability, it's not necessarily just about trying to get our stabilizer muscles stronger per se. It's more so about trying to learn, or like, I suppose like learn how to control our body in different planes of motion, because then those stabilizer muscles don't feel like they're going to be need to get stronger, or they won't feel like they're getting as beat up as much. So that can be done through movements of pronation, that can be done through getting the ribs better at externally rotating up so the shoulders don't feel like they need to externally rotate. I suppose this is just like a very short video on the introduction of it, but if you do have any specific questions about stabilizer muscles, feel free to shoot me a message. But the big takeaway is that it's more so about learning to control our body on the different planes of motion, rather than necessarily being about our stabilizer muscles trying to get stronger. But that is the big reason why barbell lifting is typically thought of as being better for stabilizer muscles, is just because barbell lifting happens on more planes of motion at once compared to machines. So yeah, thanks for